In a quiet neighborhood in Chicago, at the end of a long street called Maple Avenue, there stood an old yellow house. The paint on the walls had faded, the wooden fence was slightly broken, and the porch creaked whenever someone stepped on it. In that house lived an old woman named Margaret Wilson. Margaret was 84 years old. Her silver hair was always tied neatly in a small bun, and she wore the same soft blue sweater almost every evening. But what made Margaret unusual was a habit that everyone in the neighborhood had noticed. Every day at exactly 5 p.m., Margaret would sit beside the living room window and stare down the street. She would sit there quietly for hours. Sometimes she held a cup of tea in her hands. Sometimes she simply rested her chin on her palm and watched the road. The neighbors often wondered why. Some people thought she was lonely. Some believed she was waiting for a relative. Others said she was just an old woman with nothing better to do. But the truth was much deeper. Years ago, Margaret had not been alone. She had lived in that same house with her husband Robert Wilson. Robert had been a firefighter in Chicago. He was brave, kind, and loved by everyone who knew him. Margaret and Robert had been married for more than 50 years. Every evening after work, Robert used to walk down Maple Avenue and arrive home around 5 p.m. sharp. Margaret would always sit by the window and wait for him. When she saw him coming down the street in his uniform, she would smile, open the door, and greet him with a warm hug. It had been their daily routine for decades. But one winter evening, many years ago, a terrible fire broke out in an old apartment building in the city. Robert and his team rushed to save the people trapped inside. Many lives were saved that night. But Robert never came home. The news broke Margaret's heart. The man she had waited for every evening was suddenly gone. For weeks, she could not even walk past the living room window. The house felt empty. The silence felt unbearable. But one evening, something strange happened. At exactly 5 p.m., Margaret found herself walking toward the window again. She looked down the street just like she had done thousands of times before. Of course, Robert wasn't there. But Margaret sat down anyway. And the next day, she did the same thing. And the day after that. Years passed, but Margaret never stopped sitting by the window at 5 p.m. It wasn't because she believed Robert would come back. It was because those moments reminded her of the love they had shared. One summer afternoon, a new family moved into the house across the street. They had a young daughter named Emily, who was about 8 years old. Emily noticed Margaret sitting by the window every evening. One day, she became curious and asked her mother, "Why does that old lady sit there every day?" Her mother didn't know the answer. So the next evening, Emily decided to find out herself. At exactly 5 o'clock, she walked across the street and knocked on Margaret's door. Margaret slowly opened it. "Hello," she said gently. Emily smiled shyly. "I see you sitting by the window every day. I just wanted to say hello." Margaret looked surprised, but then her face softened with a warm smile. "Well, hello there," she said. Emily began visiting Margaret often after that. The old woman told her stories about Chicago many years ago, about firefighters, about love, and about Robert. Emily loved listening. Soon other neighbors began visiting too. What had once been the quietest house on Maple Avenue slowly filled with laughter again. People realized that Margaret wasn't just an old woman staring out of a window. She was someone who carried a lifetime of memories and love. Even now, Margaret still sits by the window at 5 p.m. But she is no longer alone. Sometimes Emily sits beside her. Sometimes neighbors stop by to talk. And every evening, as the sun slowly sets over Maple Avenue, Margaret smiles gently at the street where the love of her life once walked home. Because some habits are not about waiting. Sometimes they are simply about remembering.